Hello, thank you, Patsy, and also thank you to the Lindenhall Library for agreeing to put this event on. It is a beautiful library, a beautiful space. It is quite ironic, though, that on a day, another Belfast summer day, when there's plenty of water from the heavens, there's not water in any building in the city centre. But look, I appreciate the fact that you've come here as well on another rotten summer's day and come to the event. I am in the very unusual and discomforting position of
That's pretty weird for me too, to be honest.
interviewing my wife, which doesn't often happen. So it is about Fionnola's novel, The Stamp of Beauty. We are going to keep the time. I am going to keep my mobile here because I'm one of these annoying people that doesn't wear a watch and only gets time through their mobile phone. So I have a few questions for Finola genuinely about the book. Finola's going to read for a bit. I'll ask a few questions, but please help me out. You will find my limitations as an interviewer pretty quickly. So if there's any questions about the book or about Finola's journalism or anything else within reason, then please ask. I will be looking for a bit of help. And as Patsy says, we will wrap up by 2 o'clock. But again, thank you for coming. So first of all, I think, Finola, you are going to read a short extract from the book.
Yeah, I'm going to read a short part from it. I'll try and give you a quick bit of context. So the book is the story of a young married woman who ends up having an affair with a much older man, a newspaper editor, partly as a way of escaping from the clutches of her very manipulative mother. But as the story progresses, the similarities between her lover and her mother start to become a lot more apparent. So the name of the newspaper editor is Robbie Meredith. He's a former RUC man turned investigative journalist turned editor. So that's his background. And he lives on an island on Strangford Lough, which is a place that I'm completely fascinated by, especially the islands. I have a little boat, actually, a little wooden rowing boat, and I quite often go out around the islands and land on the islands in Strangford Lough. So that's something that's, I don't know. Well, yes, I suppose a source of inspiration, but just a general source of feeling good in life. So that's where he lives. So I'll read a short bit. It's not that long, and hopefully that will give you a bit of a sense of what this man is like. Clue: he's not nice. Robbie Riceborough was alone in the firelight. The curls and chips of the wood he was carving fell around him softly like snow. It was a little bird he was speaking tonight, a robin. The knife knew exactly where to go, sliding instinctively through the green willow, and the rounded breast soon took shape in his hands. How to whittle animals from wood was one of the few things that he'd learned from his father, the judge. Other skills, such as how to keep out of the judge's way when he was in the mood for one of his sadistic teases, Roddy picked up for himself. He turned the half-formed robin so that the light from the turf bar fell directly on it. He needed to give the pointed wings that lively, flicking quality that robins always have, and the head had to tilt at exactly the right angle, curious and questioning. He was driven in pursuit of perfection, the essential robinness of a robin. That was what he wanted to capture, the quick, brave life of the bird rendered in wood. The staff at the Sentinel would have been amazed to hear it, but Roddy loved all wild animals, with a tenderness entirely absent from the fierce, laughing, autocratic way he ran the paper. The squirrels, for instance, swinging by their tails to raid the bird feeders he hung on the washing line behind the house. He could watch those canny buccaneers for hours. The sight of a fox tracking purposefully across the wet grass in the silence of the early morning had, for him, the power to suspend time for one exquisite moment. And his heart still lifted, creaking on its moorings, when he saw the slow, solitary flight of a heron setting out across the bay at dusk. But it was the lowliest creatures that Roddy cared for most of all, the slimy ones, the crushable ones, the ones that everyone else despised. On a rainy night, arriving home late after the long drive from the city, he'd stop and pick up every single slug or snail on the front path, depositing them carefully in the wild tangle of nettles and brambles that had once been Mummy's flower garden. If he missed one and heard the ominous crunch of a breaking shell, He felt a lurch of remorse so strong that it was almost as if it wasn't the snail, but he himself who was being crushed to death underfoot, sharp shards piercing his exposed, painfully vulnerable body. Robbie kept working at the robin for some time, sculpting and smoothing, but gradually his zeal for the task began to ebb. Boredom started to nibble at the edges of his concentration, causing the knife to falter and pause. He could feel the familiar echo of emptiness invading his chest cavity, taking unsolicited soundings in his gut. He knew the forbidden places that emptiness could lead him to, the things that could make him crave and do once it got a hold. So he forced himself to press on with the carving. But soon it became obvious that it was too late. He'd lost that lovely, easy flow, the sheer mindlessness of it, and now it was just a job like any other. Worse than any other, really, because he'd failed in what he'd set out to do. He wanted to create a thing of simple truth and beauty, not this sightless, legless lump of mutilated willow tree. What was the point of carving wood if it didn't keep him busy and occupied? He needed work for his hands, a focus for his thoughts, to ward off that gnawing feeling in his chest and the seamy antidotes that his mind suggested. Crouched over the fire, he sat powerless as temptation rose in him, sly and definite and irresistible. What time was it anyway? The blameless face of his watch said 7:32 p.m. Still far too early for anything like that. He leapt up fretfully from his chair and flung the curtains open, sending them jangling and clashing the full length of the pole on their broken brass rings. Red western light flooded the bathroom, illuminating the flaking pattern of palm trees on the wallpaper and igniting the gilt rims of the cocktail glasses on the bar cart. Dust motes, set free from the thick folds of the curtains by Roddy's savage yank, danced around his head like a cloud of golden midges. The September sun was going down in splendour beyond the loch. It would be dark in half an hour, but probably not dark enough for his purposes. He would have to wait. Leaving the curtains open, he sank back into his chair and took up the knife again. Slowly twilight crept around him as he worked, head bowed diligently, like a boy at school. He didn't stop until the air was thick as ashes and he could no longer distinguish the silver blade from the pale wood. He was calm now because he had accepted what he was going to do. It was always like this. Once the little crisis of conscience was over and he'd given in, he felt fine. Better than fine, actually. Bright, alert, restored to himself. No longer empty and alone. He stood up, weighing the robin in his hand, rubbing his thumb around the smooth curve of the bird's throat, and then dropped it casually into the fire. It landed beak down, its jaunty tail poking out between the glowing banks of turf. Roddy watched it for a moment. Then he called Terence, his Staffordshire Bull Terrier, put on his coat, and went out into the night.
Thank you. So Roddy Meredith is voyeur, a damaged man, and he's got a younger lover called Lenny, who has a difficult relationship with her mother Patty. It doesn't give me a lot of comfort that you wrote a novel about dysfunctional relationships, to be honest.
Well, we all have dysfunctional families, right?
Why did you do that? What was the motivation, the genesis of this?
So the genesis of the book was actually another book that I discovered in Queen's University Library a few years ago. I was in the library looking for a completely different book. I can't remember what I was originally looking for, but my eye was caught by a large red hardback with the word Olympia on the side, and like, what's that? And got it down, and it turned out to be a book of photographs by Leni Riefenstahl of the 1936 Berlin Olympics. Now, as you may know, Riefenstahl was a very talented filmmaker, but she also made films for the Nazis. So she was a propaganda agent of the Nazis. And these photographs, they struck me because they were so beautiful. Actually, I think many of them were stills from the film Olympia, but they had athletes doing all sorts of things. But one that particularly struck me was the shots of the high dive, because the way she'd taken them, she was very innovative with her techniques and so on, and she'd taken them from below, looking up. So when the divers came down off the diving board to the pool, they silhouetted against the sky, and I mean they looked like birds. They were just such beautiful photographs. But at the same time, knowing a bit about who Leni Riefenstahl was, I was really conflicted because I knew she was bought and paid for by Hitler. So the beauty of the images and the disquiet I felt lingered with me, and I just wanted to find out more about her, why she was the way she was. Because I should also say she was totally delusional. She was completely convinced her whole life that she hadn't done anything wrong, and that she was an artist and all she cared about was art, and that politics and propaganda were nothing to do with it. As long as she stuck by her art, that was all okay as far as she was concerned. And I ended up watching a documentary that was made about her when she was, I think she was 90 years old. It was called The Wonderful Horrible Life of Leni Riefenstahl. And if you ever get a chance to watch it, it is extraordinary. She's mincing around as though she's still 19 and tossing her hair and bossing everybody about and just refusing any responsibility whatsoever for the impact of her own artistic work and her work for the Nazis. All of which is to say, I got totally obsessed. And Robbie will tell you, I do sometimes get obsessed with things. I was really obsessed with Elvis for a while. And I knew I wanted to write about her, but I didn't know in what form. And then just one day, just completely out of the blue, this character walked into my head who was really a sort of version, a Belfast version of Leni Riefenstahl. And her name was Patty Barber, and she's the mother in the book. She's one of the central characters. She's a war photographer who's very inspired by Leni Riefenstahl to the extent that she actually named her daughter Leni, which is a pretty difficult inheritance for any daughter, I would say. And that was the genesis of the novel.
And what about actually, because I'm fascinated by this, anybody who writes a novel, I've never written a novel, I have no aspiration to write a novel. I've seen it took Fionola 3 or 4 years of sitting down late at night or getting up early in the morning or suddenly keeping a notebook to jot down things. Some of you may have tried writing. I'm full of admiration for anybody who writes a novel and has the discipline to do it. So why, I suppose, what I'm getting at is, did you just feel one day you had to write a novel? Because you've been writing journalism and columns for, I can remember the first one actually, it was about Samantha Mumba in the Irish Times about 20 years ago. You did a feature profile of Samantha Mumba.
I thought my first one was the one in Fortnite about Belfast's first lap dancing club, which I can tell you about.
Okay. I thought it was about Samantha Mumba. But why did you, because I'm interested in what then makes you think I must write a novel.
Well, I've always felt like a writer ever since I was a child, I always wanted to be a writer. Always read books, still do. I can't not have a novel or something on the go. I mean, someone else's novel. I don't read a lot of contemporary fiction. I read a lot of the older stuff. But yeah, I suppose I started off. I did a PhD at Queen's University Belfast, and I'm delighted to see that Eamon Hughes is here, who launched this book for me in January, and who also taught both me and Robbie. So that's from those days. I did that, and I knew I didn't want to be an academic, but I didn't really know what I did want to do. And then that's how I ended up writing this feature about Belfast's first lap dancing club for Fortnite magazine. I'm not quite sure how I ended up doing that, but it did make me think, oh, there are other kinds of writing. After many years, I did my BA, MA, PhD. I strung it out for nearly 10 years. I was ready to have a different kind of writing, and I realised there were other kinds. So that's how I came into journalism. But I had always, throughout my life, wanted to be a fiction writer. I just didn't know how to do it. It's really hard, and like if I write my column for the Belfast Telegraph, which I was just doing this morning, that's 750 words. This is 75,000 words, and it's a very different kind of writing. So I just didn't know how to shape myself to do it. And then we have 2 children, they're grown up now, and when our daughter, the younger one, left home, I thought, right, that's it. I'm going to do it now. I'm just going to start this kind of writing. It took me a while to get revved up, but eventually I did and managed to write a novel.
But it was about 3 or 4 years work, or for 3 years work?
Yeah, because you can't work at it full time. In fact, I think if I did work at it full time, I'd go completely crazy. I mean, well, more so than I am now. Because just to be totally, you need to be immersed in it to a degree to make it happen. You need to build up that momentum. But at the same time, if I didn't have the journalism as almost like as a relief from that or an escape, then I don't think that would be very good for my head, because you know how obsessed I do get with things.
Yes.
But a quick secret in that reading that I just did, I asked Robbie in no way resembles the horrible newspaper editor, I should say, except in one thing, which is Robbie is always picks up slugs and snails if we're coming back in the evening and it's been a wet night. And he's like, watch, don't stand up. So I asked him, may I use that as Roddy Riseboro's one redeeming quality, was his care for slugs and snails. So I mean, that's not too bad.
It's not too bad. Can I ask you though why, because you've said a bit about the book, it is a slightly dysfunctional,
Very
dysfunctional relationship between three people, the younger woman, her older lover, and her mother, and obviously you find out about the relationship between her older lover and her mother, and no spoilers, but why did you decide to set it in Northern Ireland? Because in some ways, I know that's me paraphrasing it, but it's the kind of novel that could be set anywhere, and yet you chose to. And also, why make Robbie Riseborough, for instance, a former? And it's not that unusual. I actually do know, or did know. I can say this now, but the famous David Dunseith, actually, who I started working with in the BBC, the great broadcaster who's now passed away a number of years. He actually, I think, did start work he was a detective before he became a broadcaster. So it isn't a totally unknown path to go from police officer to journalist. But again, why did you set it here, and why did you actually? Because it's not really a troubles, but why did you have him as a former RUC officer?
Well, because it's a book about the past essentially, and about our past. And in many ways, Robbie Riseborough and Patty Barber, who are the older generation, as it were, a generation older than Lenny herself, they represent the past. And I wanted to ask, to what extent can we ever escape it? And I think it's very difficult to escape the past, both in a social and cultural and historical sense, but also within families. And that's another question I want to ask. How much can you change or escape what your family has handed down to you, and what you hand down perhaps to your own children? So these are some of the questions that I wanted to ask in the book. And I wanted to say to what extent has Belfast really changed, and how much chaos and dysfunction is going on under the surface here? So the Belfast in this book is quite a trendy place, and it's set around, well, I didn't want to just use the Ormo roads, I called it the Ormond Road, but I'm sure people will get the reference. And so, you have all your cafes where you can have single origin coffee or avocado toast, all of which are very nice, of course, but I think I wanted to show that there was a veneer of normality, and I think there is here in Belfast, a veneer of normality, which covers untold levels of darkness and strangeness, and that sometimes what happens is that darkness bursts through, and that happens in this book.
And why then also Strangford Lough as well? Because there's quite a contrast in the book between that Belfast and Robbie Riseborough, dysfunctional character though he is, does live in a very beautiful place.
Yeah.
So there's the contrast obviously between some of his very few of his redeeming features and his dark character, but also he lives somewhere that actually you would associate, I know personally, with a lot of light and happiness and I suppose kind of a good atmosphere. So why put him out there?
I think that's a good question. I really love that. I think a lot about islands. That's another thing I'm very interested in, is islands. And because when you land on an otherwise uninhabited island, it's only you there, to state the obvious, and you're on this small patch of land surrounded by sea. And I think, well, I don't find it a lonely experience. I find it a peaceful experience, to just escape there and be apart from the whirl of the rest of your life. And I think with Roddy Riseborough, I put him down there. It was part of the story because his father, the judge, as he's known in the book, built the house that Roddy lives in the book, and it's got a name. It's called Honolulu. And the name was given by Roddy's mother, who is long deceased, who was a bit of a handful, and gave the judge quite the runaround. And she called it Honolulu almost as a joke because it's a house that was built a modernist, quite architecturally ambitious house that was built on this bleak little Irish island. And so she called it Honolulu for a joke because that was her character, very joking, mocking character. And so I just pictured him there. I pictured Roddy Riseborough in this island linked to the mainland by a causeway in his isolation because he himself is a very isolated person. He finds it very difficult to relate in a healthy way to people. I mean, he effectively takes Lenny as a hostage, and draws her in a horribly manipulative way, that she just can't resist. Because, for various psychological reasons of her own, she's susceptible to that. Read the book if you want to find out more.
I will get a couple more questions then, please help me out here. But I'm interested in actually, it's again a bit about the process of writing. You've talked about how we can't escape our past, we all have to deal with our past. In some way, that's a truism, but I'm interested about, again, a contrast with the type of journalism we write. In some ways, the journalism I do is very deadline driven, and I've got to be quite impartial with the BBC. So, but it's usually a kind of 24-hour thing. If that, get a story to air, get it done, move on to the next thing. And even for your newspaper columns, you have a bit more time, but it's a weekly thing. What did you actually find out psychologically or emotionally about yourself when you were writing it all? Because it seems to me sometimes you get very emotionally engaged in columns you write or stories you do, but actually I imagine that kind of long 2, 3, 4 year process where you're actually delving into something so deeply in a way that we never do in our journalism. Psychologically, how does that affect you? I'm just interested. Because all I saw was you working and working and working, getting very obsessed. And I'm just wondering, did you find that anything about yourself specifically that was different?
I think it's cathartic. I think that writing a novel is cathartic because it's a way of channeling a lot of feelings and experiences and observations of your own that you've perhaps made over the years into a story. But you create your own world. You create a world. It's weird to create a world where you can go into, and it's a bit like a doll's house when you're little. That's the little world that exists, and you can move people around inside it. But what is particularly strange is that the characters do genuinely feel as though they've taken on a life of their own, and I think that's a good thing because you can't just map it all out stage after stage after stage. I mean, I think you have some idea where you're trying to go, but the characters need to take on that life of their own and make their own decisions and do surprising things because you have to be entertained as a writer as well by the story you're writing, or if it would bore you, sure as heck isn't going to entertain anyone else. So you need to have that sense of the characters as living beings, doing their own thing, and yes, perhaps acting in surprising ways from time to time that makes you go, oh, what's going on here? So in a way, you feel like I remember actually, I think it was Stephen King, to quote a very unliterary person, who said some great stuff about writing, and he said, it's not like you're making something new, it's like you're unearthing a fossil, something that already exists, that you're just trying to bring out of the ground as intact as possible, in a way that's just as intact as it can be. And when I read that first, I thought, what the heck is he on about? But now I think I'm starting to understand that more because it feels as though the book takes on an independent life of its own. It's a strange thing.
What was the most difficult part of it?
Letting go of it. Because of course that's in the first instance you pour it all out, and most of it did flow. Like there were times when I did have to sort through getting the words out, but most of it did really flow. But of course, then what you got to do is you got to hand it over to your editor, and in my editor, Susan Feldstein, I had such a great person to work with because she understood what I was trying to do, and she was excited by the story, and to collaborate with her was fantastic. Because again, well, probably this is more true of me than you, Robbie, because I'm freelance. Robbie works for the BBC, but as a freelance journalist, it's very solitary. You know, you're working away yourself, coming up with ideas in your own head. You work from home. You're not going into an office. So to actually collaborate with Susan on the editing of this book was like just such a pleasure to me, and to feel like there was that back and forth. So, but the hardest part is, yes, finally, she practically had to say, right, Fionola, this is the last version. We can't do another edit. She had to cry it out of my hands. I'll just change that little bit, or I'll change that word. You could do that forever, but at some point, you're just going to let it go.
What about casting it out onto the world? And, you know, look, I know that it was obviously a big thing for you. Fionnola's novel, The Stamp of Beauty, is published by a local publisher, Dalzell Press, which I'm in awe not only of people who write novels, but especially kind of small publishers or small presses, because it's not a multi-million-pound business. It's a labour of love, actually. But what about then the other stage? Not only of giving it to an editor, letting it go there, but also casting it out onto the world. And some people who read it might really like it, which is good. Some people have read it and liked it. Some people might read it and be indifferent to it. Some people might not. Like, you know, how does that feel? How do you prepare yourself for that, for something that's so personal to?
Well, journalism is a good preparation because as an opinion columnist and commentator and broadcaster, I am very used to getting my butt kicked about certain things that I say. You know, there's been funny instances. Like one time a few years ago, quite a few years ago now, I managed to annoy some bike riders in the Northwest 200. They didn't like what I said about it in the Telegraph, and so they came down en masse and roomed their bikes outside the Telegraph. I wasn't there, I was at home. But yeah, and more seriously, I am used to people disagreeing sometimes very strongly with what I write, and that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. But it does prepare you a bit, I think, for sending your baby, I mean your book, out into the world, and you know, getting a variety of reactions. And fortunately, of the people who've read it, the reactions have been really good. So that's so encouraging. But yeah, you know, you're always gonna look. You get some hostile reactions too. So I think the difference is that.
But that's much more personal.
I care about all the writing I do, including my media stuff. But this I care about a heck of a lot more. So there's always that sense of, you know, tread softly, be gentle with my baby.
Just one last question, then Jen, I'm going to look it up. You're obviously, I know, you are writing another novel now, you're working your way through it. Do you ever think, is this a lifelong obsession? Are you always going to be writing novels?
I'm afraid so, Robbie. I'm not letting this go. No, that's what I want to do. I mean, I will continue to do the media work, but this novel writing, fiction writing, that is what I want to do for as long as I can hold pen or type on my laptop.
Keep the TV doing.
Yeah, no, you put up Sky Sports, I can't think.
Can I appeal for help? You probably would. I am running out of questions. Does anybody have a question for Fionola about the novel, journalism, anything else? Please. Yes.
You talked, oh yeah, thank you. Hi, you talked about threads of Robbie in your characters. Are there any threads of you in either female or male characters?
That's a really good question. It's funny because Robbie Meredith is such a beast. I really enjoyed writing him. And I thought, oh my God, what does this say about me? You know, have I got this terrible alter ego? But I think there's some of me in all the characters because I wrote them. And that's one of the interesting things about writing a novel is that you do come closer sometimes to what Carl Jung called your shadow self. And that's quite a disturbing encounter. I think that's why at first you were quite reluctant to read the book, to see what awfulness went on in my head.
Yeah, it's kind of easier to read a book by someone you don't know or have never had anything to do with. You know what I mean? It is, actually.
Yeah. So that would be my answer to the question, is that it sometimes can reveal what utter badness and depravity you have in your own mind.
What about the other side as well?
What do you mean, like, to sort of talk to me that are nice? Yeah, I think the characters in the book are not necessarily particularly likable. I think Lenny is the one who's most damaged by what happens around her, by her upbringing, and also by the relationship she has with Riseborough. But I never set out to write a book about nice people. One of the things that has got me in trouble with my opinion columns is when I challenge this idea that women politicians, for example, are just so much better than men because they're so consensual and nurturing and keen to seek agreement. And I just think it's rubbish, actually. I think it's something that actually potentially holds women back because it just puts them back in the same corner they've been in for millennia. So I don't think I think there's this expectation that you will create nice characters, especially women, and I really didn't want to do that. And one of my favourite writers, Molly Keane, who, her pseudonym was MJ Farrell, she was brilliant at that. Oh goodness, her female characters, some of them were just monstrous, especially the mothers in her books, but in a very enjoyable way. So I quite like getting the badness out.
But what's that like as a reader? I'm not talking about, because I'm interested to hear your point of view in this, because obviously I find it quite difficult if I'm reading a novel where I really don't like any of the characters, or if do you need a likable character to identify with in a novel, or not, do you think?
I think so, in terms of that, human, in that, even with the Robbie character, I expect, you talk about the solace and stuff.
Yeah.
There has to be some sort of redeeming grace, I think, in everybody, how bad or dastardly they are.
I think that's a really good point, and I tried to show that in the book, that why Roddy is the way he is, the upbringing he had with a very cold and sadistic father and a mother who just had no boundaries and was all over the place with him, so he didn't ever know where he was. So it's not an excuse for his bad behaviour, but it is a kind of explanation.
Thank you very much for your
Thanks,
question.
yeah.
Anybody else got any questions?
Hi, Fionola. I'm really interested in whatever strategies you use, because I write a blog and I write memoir, and recently I've thought I'd really like to try some fiction, but I'm really scared of it.
It is scary. Starting is the scariest bit.
And then you said it was the idea of a character that came to you. So how plot driven then was it, or did you write your way into the character and then you said there's some surprises along the way, or did you structure and say, I need to get from A to B, this is what's going to happen? Did you give yourself like a loose plot structure then?
Yeah, that was very much it. I kind of knew the general direction I wanted to go in because it was just too hard. I know some writers have it all plotted out, but I felt that was too restrictive and just too hard to know where you'd end up. So the character of Patty, the war photographer, Lenny's mother, was very real to me. I think probably because of all the stuff I'd read about and watched about Lenny Riefenstahl. So it was her who was at the centre of it, and then I kind of built it around that, thinking, well, what would a daughter of this woman be like? What would it be like to have this woman as your mother? And then the character of Roddy Riseborough, well, let's just say there's various influences from people I've met over the years there. Say no more. But obviously, there's the inspiration where you start from, and then, as I say, the character sort of tends to take on a life of their own and develop in their own way.
But you did. It's an interesting question, because just from my observation of you, and obviously I wasn't there when you were writing, but you did a bit of a hybrid thing, because in a way you did plot map sometimes. Like I know you have a notebook at home where you had almost thought, arrows, this might go here, this might. So it wasn't just a case of starting and seeing where it took you.
No,
you actually did do a bit of, although, as you say, you didn't map out A, B, C, D, E. and the journeys between. But you did do a bit of that, because that is a really interesting question. I'm interested in that because I don't, imagine writing a novel, I said at the start, is so different to me and such a mystery to me. So I'm interested about that process. There was an element of world mapping that you did.
Oh yeah, like you have to. It's like I say, you have to get some idea of where you're going, but always be willing to change it. Is what I would think, because you might want to end up in somewhere completely different than the direction you're going. So it's that odd balancing act of trying to steer, but at the same time letting it develop its own momentum, which is tricky. But yeah, I just got a big A4 notebook, and just started writing things down and drawing things. Like I drew a picture of how I imagined Robbie Meredith's house, Honolulu, to look, and then that tends to prompt other things, just things you hear people saying. I remember I read that the writer Patricia Highsmith said that you just keep a notebook with you and just write down things that you hear, and it's amazing how often you'll find that you use them in the book that you're on, because it's if you just have a radar out for stuff that might work or that might help you develop one of the characters. But overall, I'd say it's just start, because I spent too long going, oh no, I'm scared, no, I can't, I'll not be good enough, no, I can't, and then just go, oh, you know what, step up, I'm just going to do this.
Thank you very much.
Hello. I'm interested in the formative experiences which will produce a character with no or fragile boundaries. I'm just wondering in what way the social skills have not developed, the normal way.
I think with Lenny, having a mother like Patty, who essentially abandoned her when she was very young and left Lenny to be brought up by her grandmother, Patty's mother, to my mind left Lenny very vulnerable, because she was always longing for her mother to be in her life and feeling rejected in a way that a child of that age couldn't really begin to comprehend or rationalize. So I feel that left her very vulnerable to essentially a predator like Roddy Reisberg, who actually in some ways had quite a similar background, but it manifested in him in this need to draw in women and to capture them and to dominate them, essentially, until he realized that he loved them or was starting to love them, and he dropped them like that. So that's, to not give too much away, that's part of the story. So I think with Lenny, because she had that upbringing with quite an austere grandmother who cared for her, but there wasn't a lot of emotional connection, and because she had that abandonment by her mother at a very young age, then it left her with those very fragile boundaries that you've spoken of. Thanks for that question.
Thank you.
I'm just interested, and this is probably a question that's the history of psychology, but what your novel seems to suggest is you can never ever escape what happens in childhood.
I think you can, if you want to be a fully rounded individual, at some point you need to look at what happened to you in your childhood. That's what I think. I think you never fully escape it, but understanding it and allowing yourself to retrospectively experience a lot of what happened to you in childhood can be a very redemptive thing.
And was that something that you wanted to explore through these characters?
Yeah. I didn't want it to leave it as a sort of message of doom that, we're all trapped in past. Although it's funny, I did keep thinking of the last line in Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. So we beat on boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. And yes, we do. We are constantly, both as individuals and as a society, we do find ourselves pulled back into the past. But if you become conscious of that and what has happened to you then I do think there's great possibilities for change.
Any other questions?
I might have a question.
Yeah.
I suppose I know you're working on a second novel, so I'm interested in knowing what you will take with you in terms of thinking that worked great for me in terms of process in the first book, and what you think I wouldn't do that again, or, you know, it would be much better if I approach things in this kind of way.
Oh, thank you, that is a good one. Yeah, do you know what I'm really trying to stop doing? It's such a bad habit. Is I just want to be able to write the new novel and just get it all down and then edit it. But I'm the worst self-editor. Like, I keep going back over sentences, going, oh, that's not quite the right word. I just want to change that bit. And these could be sentences that get cut out in the end. But somehow I find it very hard to break that sense. It's probably crippling perfectionism of going back over and over, which tends to slow your progress a bit. So that is something I'm trying to work against. But certainly the process of editing this novel with Susan, that taught me a heck of a lot about shaping a book and structuring it even retrospectively. So that is something I'm trying to apply with this new one. And I suppose it gives you more confidence once you've done the first one. And maybe that's to go back to your question. Once you actually say, oh right, I can actually do this, then I think that certainly helps.
We have about, I think about 5 minutes left, or 5-10 minutes. Any other questions?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I know you talked about the written style influence, and I know you talked about the written style influence, and obviously there's a photograph at the centre of everything. But I was listening to you talk about the past and its inescapability, personally and socially, culturally, politically. But by making the past that it was haunting these people a photograph, there's a very self-contained aspect to that. I mean, we're in a society with a lot of unfinished stories of one kind or another. Was the photograph deliberately chosen to be contained in that way?
No, I hadn't thought of that at all. Although I am very influenced by visual art more generally. And in fact, actually, I'm sure you probably can't really see this, but because this was my first sort of artist proof copy that I was so excited to get and hold. But on the front is a painting of a woman's face. It's actually by my friend Nisha Allen. She's a Belfast artist, very talented. And I knew when I saw that painting, I thought, oh, I really, really hope she would let me use that for the front of the book, because I think it's so striking. And again, it's that idea of someone who's trapped, someone who is peeking out in an almost a wary, slightly suspicious way, confined perhaps in the past, but tentatively looking towards the future. So while I never consciously thought in those particular terms, I do think that visual images and the idea of photography more generally did influence my thinking about the book. And also I did quite a lot of research into war photographers and the kind of photographs that they took. And not to give too much away about the story or to give too much away about the plot, but one of the things that they did was quite often that they moved bodies in order to create a better shot, which is extraordinary when you think about it. I mean, there's some very famous ones, a couple of which are referenced in the book. For example, during the American Civil War, there's a famous instance of a photographer taking a body off the battlefield and propping it in the doorway of a ruined cottage, just because that would look better. So it starts you thinking all about the ethics of how we make images, how we make art, how we tell stories, and what we consider morally acceptable, I suppose.
It's interesting to talk about getting inspiration from visual art. You've mentioned Molly Keane. Are there any other writers that, well, both specifically influenced you in terms of wanting to write, but also do you have to then be aware that you're not imitating, or because it must be quite difficult, people who influence you, but you don't want to directly imitate them in what you're writing?
Yeah, that is good, because we'll just drag it back to Molly King, because she is my favorite. I mean, I like a lot of other authors, but just her works are, I would say, sort of wickedly funny and painfully true at the same time. And if you don't already know, she she sort of chronicled the big house, the Anglo-Irish ascendancy world, and she was from that world, but she did it with such a cunning, wicked eye. And she's often described as the Irish Jane Austen, which I kind of understand to a degree, but Jane Austen never did things like, hardly even like to say some of the things that Molly Keane wrote about, but they're fun and very, very cruel. And I enjoy that. Probably must have a sadistic streak to my character. Would you say, Robbie? Yeah.
Don't say anything. But did you then have to, were there, because you obviously, I know you've read Molly Keane's novels a number of times.
Over and over again.
Because I don't know what you're like, but I read a novel once and that's it. And even I enjoy it. You reread novels sometimes 4 or 5 times. And I know you did that with Molly Keane's novels. So did you have to be careful then not to? It's a very different book, but did you have to be careful to kind of keep Molly Keane out of it?
Not really, because I think once I started, I realised I was just going my own way, and all the books that you've ever read and all the writers you've ever admired, maybe since you were 4 or 5 years old, it's all in there in the background, informing you and guiding you and inspiring you. But once you start off in your own direction, that's you, for better or worse.
Look, I am out of questions. If you all are, I'd like to thank you and thank Patsy again, the Lynn for coming here today. We actually genuinely didn't know if anybody would turn up. So
I thought they would come
we didn't
with
arrange
just
for any books.
I thought he's the famous one. I thought they'd come.
You're talking about me like I'm Baron Best or
Oh
something.
no, we're not talking at that level, Robert.
So, but it is for sale at No Alibis on Botanic Avenue and also on Amazon.
Oh, please do buy it if you find it at all interesting.
And look, thank you again for coming today.
Thank you, yeah.
Thank you.